myself. Thanks, Carolyn. I know I talked to Dennis Becker a little earlier today. He was on his way into the office. I don't know if he's on yet, so I'll just take this until maybe he does show up. What we did yesterday, and Carolyn, you were helpful among others, is we took some questions and comments from people both on the chat room and then both through Dennis and my emails. And we've got a couple of things, so I will just bring them up. And one of the reasons is for people that are in the collaboratives and with some experience can, I think probably since we only have less than 15 minutes until our presentation by Chelsea, maybe they can be responding as comments on the chat room. That's just my thought. I don't really care how we do it, but that might be the most efficient. So the first, in no particular order, I got an email from someone in the Forest Service yesterday who talked about Nora when addressing the turnover in the agency about, you get different rangers, soups and so forth, and a lot of revolving leadership, and how aware they are that makes relationship building more difficult. We all know that when agency people move around, because they move around for very legitimate reasons most of the time. But then the point came up about how do collaborative groups, how are they able to pass on their institutional knowledge and wisdom as their members come in and out? John McCarthy for years was integral to this group, but John moved on to do other stuff. That's an example. I'm sure the collaborative groups have experienced that a lot. And I think how you find people to replace people who move on is just as important in the collaboratives groups as it is in the Forest Service or Department of Lands for that matter. And so that came up. The whole thing that Tony will be able to address that in his presentation for some extent, but any kind of collaborative group wisdom there about how they've had to deal with this, because these collaboratives, some of them in Idaho, they've been around a while. And so they must have had to develop good procedures. And I do remember in the past that has been addressed at some of these conferences, but it never hurts to bring it up again because it's kind of an immediate issue, I think. Another question then is kind of related to this in a different way. It's more about the stewardship areas, but it's about the movement of resources. In other words, when you've got resources in our national forests, are they moving to the stewardship areas? And what does that necessarily mean for the rest of a national forest if the stewardship areas are getting more attention? And then, of course, this could be something that could be addressed by Southern Idaho Collaborative Group folk. We've got them in Southern Idaho too. How's that going? How's that being dealt with in the Southern Idaho Collaboratives and stewardship areas? So that was a couple that came up. Another question that got asked was, which particular collaborative group has been the most successful in encouraging and supporting regeneration, harvest, and reforestation activities? I guess you could say which one has made the most progress in that area. And it may be interesting to know that because of the kind of relationships in that collaborative, or maybe leadership in the agencies working well with the collaboratives to be able to make that happen. So that was another question that came up. I have a couple more, I think, that I can bring up for folks here in a second. I got to call them off my email in this case. But very important one, and I think this maybe comes from newer folks that are new to collaboratives, and I know there's reading material that Dennis Murphy has been able to put on the website in the past, but it's always important to ask this one again. What are the best practices that have developed for collaboration? And again, I think both our two, Chelsea and Tony, will be discussing that to some extent, and so people ought to listen closely to what they have to say in that area. But that was a email that that I got late in the day. And then another one that relates to collaboratives again, and it's a question of what sort of support is available for facilitation and planning for collaborative groups. Now, I know, having listened to these collaboratives over the years with their experiences, some of them have very effective and kind of set procedures for facilitation, how they do it. The rules in the group are well established. Others may not if they're newer or the members are newer to them. And also then, I guess you could say, the planning backup support for the collaborative to function, because the agency can do some things, but they don't want to be too in the middle of it, obviously. And in the collaboratives, everybody in there has another responsibility. They have another job. Sometimes they're county commissioners, people like that. And so how do they get the backup support they need to be effective in that area? So those were some of the questions we got. I know Dennis has a couple more, but I don't know if Dennis is online yet. So I don't have those other ones. So go. If anybody wants to, since we've got an open mic and weigh in here, we've got a few minutes before Chelsea presentation, so we could open the mic up if anybody wants to say something related to these questions, or really anything else right now well, I thought about this overnight and I really would like to bring it up since I've got a minute. Feel free to do that right now. And if not, after a while, we can see if Chelsea's ready and she can start her presentation if she wants to start earlier. So we won't have a lot of dead time, I don't think. Anybody? Can also type me a message too, and I can read off of that if you want to do it that way. We've got about 3 or 4 more minutes, I think, at least. Oh, here's a good one for always stepping up. John Robeson. Good question, John. Thanks. One thing he urges everybody to think about, and again, John's been involved in this for a long time. What is success looking like now, or what do you want it to look like in 5 years from now? In other words, more acres treated. It's up to you guys to develop your measures of success. Better relationships that allows people to move forward, less conflict. What are those measures of success? Where would you like to look in 5 years? That's from John. And I think people are trying to track Dennis down right now. These deans, Anybody else? Chelsea, do you think you're ready to go? I know I saw her.
John, we had something from Lance Davidson.
Oh, okay.
Lance, you're now unmuted.
Oh, thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, great.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Good. Go ahead.
So I did want to bring up the opportunity. We've done some facilitation work with the NRCS around some of their approach to be more and more collaborative. And I've been in and out of the meeting yesterday and today with family stuff, but I didn't see if there are some NRCS folks involved. The reason that I mention is that there's so much opportunity to do cross collaboration between these efforts focused on Forest Service and NFS lands, and also what the USDA is trying to do better with the NRCS. And so if you ever kind of want to help build a dialogue there, I can reach out to the folks we worked with at NRCS to do that. Because I think, like you said, every collaborative is different. There's different policies and practices that help you operate effectively. And I think the NRCS could learn a lot and also help accomplish their goals by being involved in the collaborative groups through the Forest Service that you're all doing.
That's a great observation. I don't know if we have NCRS or NRCS members, but Carolyn might be able to look, or we can look. People can skim the list of people on Zoom chat. I know you're right about that, though. That they are very effective in some things where the agencies, because of different roles and missions, aren't necessarily as able to do the things they are. They certainly on things like sage grouse and habitat really did a lot of good work back in during that time. Hey, I've got one more. I think we have a little more time. This is from Peg Palicio. A question for John Irie about regeneration issue for the Panhandle Collaborative. Bad or tough forest conditions warranted and changed to certain species as white pine. You're the facilitator for that group. I think Peg's sort of asking where are we at on that one right now, if you can address it.
And then, I'm sorry, I mistyped. It's for Ben Irie, who is the NFF facilitator for the Panhandle Collaborative. And they do have some zone of agreement around regeneration cuts in root disease, very poor forest health condition stands, which are on the Panhandle, and the conversion to, or at least the improvement of conditions with white pine and western larch. Ben, can you address that, how that's being handled on the Panhandle? You're muted, Ben.
Hey, just unmute yourself.
There you go.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Great.
Yes.
So zone of agreement and regeneration harvest. Peg, I'm not sure I am actually qualified to answer that because most of that agreement had occurred before I was facilitating the PFC. Mike, I don't know if Mike is on the line and can speak to that, or Liz, or anybody else from the PFC, but I can remember the first field trip that we went on. I was encouraged to see that so many people everybody seemed to be on the same page with that stuff at the time. Phil, I think you're on.
Yeah, it's taking a minute to unmute myself. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we have found zones of agreement and priorities, but it's been driven or led by a process in which we engage with the agency to help identify those priority landscapes. And I think one of the reasons we've had a great deal of success is the trust and relationships built up over the years allow us to have a free exchange of ideas between the areas of our interest to the economics of the timber producers, their professional foresters who are out in the field evaluating these things, and conservationists who are out in the field also evaluating the needs. And by having some honest, frank conversations up front about what the potential traps are, we were able to avoid those and then look at and identify with a great deal of consensus the priority areas and move fairly rapidly through to the producing some viable projects. I think that's generally what you were looking for.
Great. So, Carolyn, you're sort of running the thing. It looks like it's about time to go to Chelsea. Is that what everybody prefers at this point? To keep it kind of on.
Yeah, and Dennis is here now. But yes, I think it's about that time to move to Chelsea.
Okay. Dennis, why don't you introduce Chelsea if you're online?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry I'm late. I got the whole northern Idaho, southern Idaho mix up here, so I was off the time zone. Apologize for that. Yeah, so you guys are up and rolling already, so I won't attempt to recover where you're at with things, but let me introduce Chelsea and by extension also Tony, who will follow. So Chelsea is a PhD student at the University of Idaho. Chelsea and I have been working together for a couple of years now on a variety of projects. Chelsea comes to us from Montana, where she was previously with BBER, working on a lot of related issues and has a lot of experience working with collaboratives. I'll let Chelsea talk a little more specifically about her project, but in general, sort of the setup here is that Chelsea's going to attempt to answer the question, to what degree have collaboratives changed the pace and scale or affected the pace and scale of treatments on national forest lands, and to do that through a variety of metrics that she's evaluating. So, it's really in a snapshot, a look at how, sort of the capacity of collaboratives to deliver. Tony is going to follow then with more of an in-depth conversation about sort of the dynamics of what collaboratives face and how do they maintain momentum. There were some questions offline last night about the degree to which there is turnover within Forest Service and state ranks. There's also a lot of turnover, as we heard yesterday, in the ranks of the collaboratives themselves. And we're kind of at a point in time now with a number of our collaboratives where our longstanding individuals who have had great influence over the trajectory of collaboration in the state of Idaho or even the Western U.S. Are moving on. They're retiring. And so thinking about, sort of the young blood and the new individuals that are part of that new dynamic and our new way of doing forest management now. And so I think Tony's going to talk a little bit more about some of those dynamics, and then hopefully we can have a good conversation building on that. So with that, I would introduce and turn this over to Chelsea to lead us in her conversation.
Great, thanks, Dennis. Can all hear me, I assume? Yes, okay. Well, it's really great to see a bunch of familiar faces and names, especially these days. And thanks so much for inviting me to present today. And thanks for that introduction, Dennis, and that background. So as you said, I'm with the Policy Analysis Group, and we've been working on this study, and we're pretty excited to be talking about some of the results, so that we can all have a better understanding and contribute to this body of knowledge that we have, and in addition to our own experiences around the influence that collaboration is having on the pace and scale of management on public lands. And for this particular study, we're looking just at collaboration and its influence in Idaho. Let's see here. So just really briefly, for anybody who's not familiar with the Policy Analysis Group, it was established in 1989 by the Idaho legislature. It's very unique in that sense, and it was created to provide timely, scientific, and objective analysis and information on issues related to natural resources in the state and of interest to state stakeholders. And we have economists and social scientists and policy analysis analysts on staff. This just gives you a general sense for some of the projects that we worked on recently, the kind of breadth of topics that we take on. There we go. And so just a little bit more in terms of background, when I was approached to lead this project, I'll be honest, my response was certainly curious, but also pretty skeptical. And, I've been involved in collaboration for over a decade. I worked as a funder with the National Forest Foundation, funding collaborative groups across the country. I provided staff support for the Montana Forest Restoration Committee, which is a statewide collaborative group. And I've been a sitting member on the Lolo Restoration Committee for a decade as well. And I think for anyone involved in collaboration, it's a pretty natural response to be somewhat skeptical about this idea of reducing such a varied and multifaceted deliberative process down to numbers. But I took the challenge in part because it did combine a couple of my favorite things, collaboration and data. And so I think, from my standpoint, we've collectively done a really good job of communicating about our impact and successes related to building trust and bringing diverse voices to the table, building and strengthening relationships and expanding the zone of agreement. And this is builds a really good foundation for collaboration. But I do think for the movement to continue to increase its legitimacy, we do need to find a way to roll up all of our individual accomplishments into a collective story about the impact of collaboration. And that's, you know, what we're hoping to sort of take the first step towards with this study. And so this map is from the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership website. They do a great job of tracking what's happening in the state. So you can see the locations of all of the collaboratives in the state. And this study was largely made possible also because of their great work tracking all of the projects that these collaboratives have been working on. And so we relied on that information heavily. And so our study included 7 of these 10 collaboratives. And they're distributed across the 6 of the 7 national forests in the state. And that was mostly just because some of those collaboratives are new and they didn't have any projects on record yet that had reached the implementation stage. And so when we set out and initiated this project, when we were thinking about it, we really developed 4 goals for the project. Of course, we wanted to investigate how collaboration is influencing management on national forests in Idaho. We also wanted this information to be able to help agency and collaborative groups communicate about their impact. We wanted to provide information that could inform program and policy discussions. And then finally, we wanted to develop methods that would be replicable and could be expanded to other areas of the country, other administrative units of the Forest Service. And so for that reason, we made the decision to rely on administrative data. So data that's already being collected by the agency. And this led us to looking at and utilizing 2 main data sources. One that collects information on project planning, the planning process. And that includes information about, you know, location and of course, the names of projects, you know, the administrative unit where they're taking place, and some of the legal outcomes of those projects. And then we relied on the other database is called SACS, and that is a database that collects information on project accomplishments. So both of these databases, actually, I'll get to the metrics here, have the added benefit of using the NEPA project as a unit of analysis. And so that allowed us to marry these 2 databases. And from there, then, we developed, we worked to develop metrics that would try to get at these measures of pace and scale. And so you can see what we ended up using here as our metrics to get at this concept of pace. We were able to glean information on the number of days that projects were taking to get from initiation to decision. And then related to that, in terms of efficiency, we were able to look at then the number of acres that were being treated, that were accomplished per planning day that was invested up front. For scale, we looked at the number of acres that were treated per project. And then we were able to look at this idea of complexity as well, and that just came out of what was available in these data sets, and that is measuring the number of unique activities that are being accomplished in a given project, and also the number of unique objectives, programmatic objectives that are being met. And then finally, of course, we are able to capture a number of other metrics and variables that are pretty critical for looking at this data. Of course, decision type, so the level of analysis associated with a given project. Again, legal outcomes, whether the project was appealed or litigated. Of course, whether the project was collaborative or not. And again, we really relied on the data being collected by IFRP to identify those projects. The name of the collaborative and the national forest in which the project is taking place. And so we don't necessarily we don't suggest that these are the end-all be-all measures. They aren't maybe even necessarily the best measures in a perfect world, but they are measures that we can get and we can access through data that's already being collected, and there's a lot of value in that. So I'm going to jump right into talking about some of our results. And then I'm hoping then at the end to have enough time left over for some questions. And so looking first at questions of case, we were, because we were able to access over 10 years worth of data, we were first interested in whether there were any noticeable changes over time when we compared collaborative and non-collaborative projects. And this graph does indicate that there were. You can see both the degree of variation from year to year, the gray line being traditional projects and the greenish line being collaborative projects. And then you can see the linear trend there as well, and that there's also a pretty significant difference there. However, we did also realize that pretty quickly that looking at the data in aggregate, it has pretty limited utility because of the level of variation within projects across levels of analysis. And so what we did then is broke down the data to look at projects by level of analysis. And so here we're just looking at categorical exclusions. We're measuring the number of days that it took for the project to get from initiation to decision, and how that changed over time. And so overall, there has been a decreasing trend in the number of days that it takes to get to decision for a categorical exclusion. Oh, here's the cat. And that there is a slight difference between collaborative and non-collaborative projects. That difference is about a 14% reduction. Although for all of these differences, so descriptively, you know, there's a reduction, a small difference between the two groups, but statistically, they're not significant, and I'll just state that up front. The next category is environmental assessments. Same data, we're just looking at the number of days from project initiation to decision and comparing collaborative and non-collaborative projects. A great deal of variation from year to year. And also some pretty different trend lines, so between collaborative and non-collaborative projects. And that's pretty consistent. You'll see that that's pretty consistent across the different levels of analysis. So in this case, we did find that there was a 2% increase in the number of days that it took to get from initiation to decision for collaborative groups compared to non-collaborative projects, I should say. And then finally, environmental impact statements, where we did find that there was an 8% collaborative projects were associated with an 8% reduction in the number of days to initiation. Although, as you can kind of see from our timeline, there were very few EISs to evaluate. There are far fewer than EAs or CEs, as you can imagine, and the data are a little sparse. So we'll come back a little bit to talking about efficiency at the end, but this gives an overall view of just the variation among forests. And this is just an average for each forest of the number of days it took to plan projects and compares collaborative and non-collaborative projects. And you can see in some forests, collaborative groups are on average projects are on average taking a little bit longer, and in others, they're on the average, that pace is quite a bit faster. And these are affected by a lot of things that, of course, we can't necessarily measure with the data that we have. So there are many other influences, many reasons why these trends would be different by forest. And one thing I will say, I think I meant to say this up front, is you know, this project, when we first started talking about it, going around and talking to different collaborators about it, understandably, raised a decent amount of anxiety among collaboratives. And having sat on a collaborative, that was something that I could really understand, in part because of this challenge of reducing collaboration down to numbers, but also because I think I had my own sort of discomfort with it for a while, and that it felt strange to be coming up with a scorecard to evaluate collaboratives. And I realized after a while of sort of sitting in an uncomfortable space, right, that we weren't really necessarily, we were not evaluating the effectiveness of collaboratives so much as we are evaluating agency decision-making in the context of collaboration. Because as as all of you know, having been involved in collaboratives, their decision space is somewhat limited, you know, in that the agency retains the final authority to make decisions, and the agency has their own constraints and other influences that are impacting their decision making, how fast they plan projects. There are all these other variables, and so, but we did feel like by looking at this, we might be able to isolate how collaboratives might be influencing the agency's decision making, as seen through these metrics of pace and scale. And so I'm going to talk now about our results related to scale and complexity. And again, scale we were measuring is just the total number of acres that were treated by project. And this includes some double counting in the sense that we're counting all treated acres. And so some acres are treated twice for different, with different objectives, different treatments. So there's some double counting here, but when we look at the numbers across these levels of analysis, we do find that with the exception of categorical exclusions, collaborative projects do tend to be larger. They tend to be treating more acres per project than traditional projects. And they also, across the board, tend to be more complex, and that is that they are accomplishing more diverse activities on those acres than a traditional project would. And not surprisingly, then, they're also accomplishing a more diverse set of programmatic objectives through those projects. And these differences are statistically significant in this case. And so now I want to talk a little bit about this idea of efficiency. It was actually an idea that I got from the meeting with some folks in the regional office, where some folks in the planning shop were already thinking in these terms. It wasn't something I had really thought about before, about agency efficiency and how do the number of acres that they actually get accomplished for a project relate to the number of days that they put into the planning process. And so, like I said, you know, we found some of these small differences in planning timelines between collaborative and non-collaborative projects. They were not statistically significant differences. But we do find that while our results don't necessarily support the hypothesis that collaboration is effectively increasing planning timelines, increasing the pace of projects, they're also not validating criticisms that collaborative groups are inefficient or wasteful. What we found was that there was just no significant difference in planning timelines between collaborative and non-collaborative projects. That we think is interesting and important in and of itself. But when we combine that with our finding that collaborative groups are accomplishing, they're treating more acres and meeting more objectives and accomplishing more diverse activities, then we really find that you could say that they are in many ways adding efficiency and really adding value in that way. And so then this idea or this criticism again that collaboratives are inefficient, this really points to the value of the argument that what am I trying to say? That the choice to engage in collaboration does not have to be at the expense of efficiency, because that's really the point that I'm trying to drive home here. And so then finally, we did look at some legal outcomes from the projects, and we're able to compare collaborative and non-collaborative projects. And again, while this is really out of the control and even not necessarily an expectation of collaboration, that appeals and objections and litigation rates will go down, you know, we did find that those projects that were collaborative had a higher probability of being appealed or objected or litigated. Collaborative projects were 4.5 more times more likely to be appealed or objected, and 10 more times likely to be litigated. However, we also know that those projects are much more complex. And so if we control for the size and the complexity of projects, that relationship between collaboration and appeals and objections actually disappears, and there's no difference between collaborative and non-collaborative projects. And that relationship between collaboration and litigation reduces from a factor of 10 down to a factor of 3.6. And so it is really important to look at those characteristics of the project and take that into consideration when looking and thinking about these legal outcomes. And of course, as all of you know, the other thing we have to take into consideration is that collaborative governance, it's all sort of indicative of the space that collaborative governance resides in. It gained prominence in part as a solution to intensifying gridlock surrounding natural resource and public land issues. And so for that reason, we argue that collaboration is present because there's underlying conflict, and this conflict can be more likely to attract what we call veto players or litigants. And so I want to talk a little bit more about where we want to go with this project moving forward, some of the things that I'm thinking about, that we're thinking about, and that has to do with these are things that have come out of some of the conversations that we've had as we've been going around and presenting and talking about this study, both as it was in process and since we've had some results to share. And one of those is, one of the themes that has come out of some of those conversations is the role that that agency, the willingness of line officers to be early adopters, to be innovators, take risks, and I've had that described as sort of being willing to be public figures and be in the paper, the role that and the impact that that has had on collaborative success. A number of collaboratives have really pointed to that as something that's been really critical, they feel, to many of their successes, is having this there's one or many line officers that have been really willing to innovate and try new things. The other thing, of course, that we're always thinking about and tracking are existing authorities and potential new authorities that could really support collaboration and enhance its success. Funding, of course, is always an issue there as well. And then the other is, this is a little bit harder to get at, but wanting to think about the influence that leadership changes, which has already come up, John talked about that in his introduction, and changes in agency capacity overall, and what impact are those having on the agency, and then by extension, what impact might those things have on the success of collaboratives and their ability to meet some of those shared objectives. And so those are things I throw out there, like I said, that we're thinking about and may be able to talk in more detail about in the near future. I think, yes, that is my last slide. I hope I left a little bit of time for some questions. This is our contact information if you do want to get in touch with us and have any questions or just want to talk about the study. I know I welcome that at any time.
So Chelsea, I'll pose a question, and if other folks have questions, then by all means jump in. It's unfair perhaps for me to ask the first question since I'm on the study, but I guess I'd ask you to talk a little bit about what constitutes a collaborative project and sort of the challenges we had in isolating that variable in the context of other activities that collaboratives influence, but the project may not be deemed quote unquote collaborative.
Yeah, Dennis, that's a really great question, and you're right, I did not really address that. Yeah, I mean, this project definitely, it treats collaboration as this sort of, clear dichotomy. It's a product is either collaborative or it's not, and as we know in practice that's not really accurate. It's not a good portrayal of collaboration. We know that collaboration is really much more of a spectrum, and there are variations in the level of engagement. There are variations in the diversity of interests that are involved. What a collaborative group looks like varies a lot from place to place. And then we know that the agency has a variety of other public engagement methods as well that some may call collaboration or not. Like I mentioned, we relied a lot on the IFRP data and information that they collect. We decided to define collaboration as a project that a collaborative had sort of taken ownership of in some formal and sort of public way, you could say. And so that is one sort of qualification, certainly for this study. And the other, I think, that Dennis also is getting at is this idea of the spillover effect, right? That collaboration might have, whereby collaborators may not take responsibility or take ownership of a particular project, but in what way is the zone of agreement and the work of that collaborative having a spillover effect on all projects? There are many, or at least similar projects that are being implemented on a given forest. And that's hard to measure, but I think we can be, in many cases, reasonably sure that that is happening. And of course, we know over time that the social expectations and values change, and that has this impact on changing, the kinds of projects and design of projects, and that also is something that is pretty hard to isolate. So yeah, those are important things to understand for sure. With this study and with working with data like this, but there's some things we just can't measure.
So I have a question from Tim Love in Montana. And Tim, forgive me, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with your question and expand it just a bit. So Chelsea, we found that in Idaho, sort of at a very broad scale, that collaboratives are making a difference. The complexity, the number of acres treated have increased under this collaborative umbrella. At the same time, it has not had an appreciable impact on the length of time of planning in most cases. So I want you to talk a little bit about, do you think that will hold true in Montana? Do you think that will hold true in other parts of the West? And are you looking at that or have plans to look at that?
Yeah, also a good question, Tim. So I'm going to start at the end and then work backwards. I'll start with the easy question, I guess, first, and that is that do we have plans to expand this to other areas? I guess it's not easy in the sense I can't say that I don't know for sure, but there's certainly interest. I have interest, of course, because of my history of working in Montana. I have an interest in expanding this at least to Montana. And actually, we do have data for all of regions 1 and 4. And so there is the distinct possibility that we could expand to not only Montana, but potentially to Utah as well. So hopefully, yes, is the answer to that part. And then, do we reasonably expect a lot of the same trends in other places? I think given that, particularly if we're talking about planning timelines and we're talking about, the influence or working within the structure of the National Environmental Policy Act, I would say it's pretty likely that these findings are going to be similar in other places. I do think, though, that how they relate to the scale and complexity questions might vary a little bit more, and what that relationship looks like. But there's no way to know, and I think that's one of the real sort of exciting parts about this study is that it is relatively easily replicable in other places, and we can start to answer that question.
Great. I just have one more question for you. And that refers to, it's from Pam Hardy with the Western Environmental Law Center. So Pam's question is, maybe reflect a little bit more on, you had a graph where you had the different collaboratives and how that, time to completion was different for those different collaboratives. Talk a little bit about new versus established collaboratives and sort of their effectiveness, but maybe also, sort of the temporal aspect of this. So even collaboratives over time in and of themselves, did you witness sort of behavioral changes within collaboratives, not just across? Right.
So I think that graph that you're referring to, it was actually a comparison of projects by forest. So some forests have more than one collaborative. So I guess that's why I say it wasn't necessarily a comparison of collaboratives against each other, or it was more a comparison of what's happening on various forests and how and show the amount of variation. And sorry, Dennis, what was the second part of that question?
Essentially just sort of the efficiency of the collaboratives themselves. Right. I have a couple of other questions coming into that effect as well. Steve Dempsey, have the collaboratives, using Rick Tholen's, terminology, have they gained muscle memory and got more efficient over time in and of themselves?
Right. So yes, so that is also a great question. I've looked at it a little bit. One of the challenges is just the small number of projects, particularly when you drill all the way down to a given collaborative, one specific collaborative. While we do have 10 years of data, we also all know that projects take a long time to plan, not only within the collaborative, but then to get through the planning process on the agency side and get to implementation. And so, you know, the overall number of projects that we were looking at didn't necessarily allow us to make any generalizations, useful generalizations around how that might be changing over time. I do hope that once we can start, if we can start adding data from other states or other areas, other national forests, et cetera, that we can start pulling that all together and we'll have enough collaborative projects to look at that we can start looking at how those trends might change over time and associating some other characteristics to those collaboratives about, like you said, about how long they've been around, how long they've been working together. And as I mentioned, also, you know, some of the other things I would like to be able to associate with that, especially those time series, thinking in terms of changes over time, are changes in leadership, changes in agency capacity, because, you know, as much as changes in collaboratives affect these outcomes, obviously changes on the agency side do too. So if we can look at both of those, I think we can get a lot better picture of what's happening and start to, again, just, you know, answer more questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chelsea. And true to form, you know, the intention of this project was not to be a black and white picture of who's doing good and who's doing bad, but really to generate conversation. And I can tell you in the private chat box, I'm seeing lots of great questions. In the public chat box, there's good questions. And so, you know, we will endeavor to provide this study to, and Chelsea, I think folks would like to see your presentation too, and I think that'll be made available on the IFRP website. But the study right now is in peer review, and so the idea is to try to get this out to a broader audience. So thank you, Chelsea, for that. I'm going to transition to Peg Paluccio to introduce a couple of new folks that we have on the line before we move any further, and then perhaps after that, then I'll introduce Tony for our next speaker.
Thanks, Dennis and John. It occurred to me that one of the great things about my job is I get to work all over the state, and I know so many people on this platform. We have a bunch of new leaders with the Forest Service and out in the collaboratives, and if we just have a few minutes, maybe they could say hello. First up, Tanya Burnett, who is the new Forest Supervisor of the Boise National Forest. Tanya, are you still there? Tried to give people a heads up, but they may or may not be at their desks.
There she is.
Hey, Peg. Sorry about that. Couldn't get myself off mute quick enough. Hello, everybody.
Thanks, Tanya. Good to see you. And for people around the state, in the far corners of the state, to get to know one another. Next up, Linda Jackson, new Forest Supervisor of the Payette National Forest since last year. Linda, are you on? Oh, and I'm not hearing her. I saw her name. She may not be near her machine right now. Lynn Oliver, do you want to say
Hey,
hello?
she's there. Hold on, Peg,
Oh.
she's there. I'm trying to unmute her.
Okay. Linda?
Can
There we
you?
go. There we go.
All right. So can you hear me
Great.
now?
Yeah.
Okay, great, good. It's nice to be part of all this of the group.
Thanks for
Thank you.
joining, Linda. I'll just take a few more, and then maybe later on, there are several new people that are in the collaboratives that we might want to introduce later on when we have time too. Lynn Oliver, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be on the this IFRP presentation. Having a great time.
And Lynn is the new Priority Landscape Coordinator for the Payette Boise National Forest in cooperation with IDL for Southern Idaho. Is that enough? Is that all the time I have, Dennis?
Oh, if you want to introduce a few more folks, this is fun.
Okay, go for it. Hey, Tim Love, do you want to say hello from Montana?
Yeah, I will.
Hi, Peg. Dennis, it's nice to join everybody. I'm the coordinator for the Montana Forest Collaboration Network.
Thank you. And I have Irene Jerome on and Diane Olson from the Caribou Targhee, the Caribou Initiative. And Irene is with AFRC, and Diane, I believe, is the new facilitator down there. The newest collaborative in Idaho, I believe. Is that right, John Robeson? So,
yeah. Sorry.
Irene?
Well, I just got unpaused if Irene can show herself, but yeah, the CFI group has been working along for a while, but picking up speed the last year or so.
Great. And really appreciate that. Okay, guys, thanks. I don't hear Irene, but we should use this platform like we would if we were meeting in the hallways down at the Riverside in Boise or up here in Coeur d'Alene. So thanks for letting me do that.
Great, thanks, Peg. And if we have time at the end, it might be nice if there's other folks, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, new to the game, so to speak. We'd love to hear from you. Now I'm going to introduce Tony Chang. Tony's a longtime friend of mine. Just great to see him online here today. Tony's been working on collaboration, I won't say how many years, but I will say that Tony has been a real influencer in academic circles and a real influencer within leadership circles about how to think about collaboration and support collaboration within the agencies. And so, Tony, thanks for being on today. I'll turn it over to you.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I was actually supposed to be join IFRP last year. Rick Bowen and I had some conversations. He extended an invite last year, and then the furlough, the government shutdown pushed a lot of the scheduling, and we decided the timing wasn't right, and so the invite came this year, and here we are kind of adapting and adjusting. So one of these days, I'm actually going to attend an IFRP conference in person. Idaho has a special place in my heart. I was born and raised in Pullman, Washington, so about 6 miles from the Idaho border, and spent a lot of my childhood going to church camp at Camp Twinlow, which is just north of Coeur d'Alene. And I worked at, and I attended and worked as a Boy Scout counselor at Camp Grizzly, just east of Potlatch, Idaho. So I know that at least the northern part of Idaho really well. Also want to shout out to Tyler Beaton, who helped put a lot of the materials together that I'm going to present to you in this presentation. Tyler works for me at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and Tyler's on the meeting right now. Just a little bit more by the way of introduction. I'm a professor at Colorado State University in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department, and I'm also the director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. CFRI is one of 3 institutes in the Southwest. We are collectively known as the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes. There's one at Northern Arizona University Ecological Restoration Institute, and one at New Mexico Highland University. And we have a collective mission to work collaboratively in developing and applying the locally relevant science to inform forest restoration, fire risk management at a landscape scale. And so this is kind of work we've done for probably the last 15 years or so. And currently right now, my organization's involved in about 12 different collaborative efforts. And then from my personal and professional work in my own research, I study collaborative resource management across a variety of contexts. So it's something that's very near and dear to my heart as well. And so happy to be here. So the topic I've been asked to talk about today is really trying to get at this question of how do collaboratives evolve and sustain over the long term. And I'm going to introduce the concept of collaborative resilience, and then try to distill that concept down into an actual worksheet exercise that we will be spending some time in breakout groups after my presentation. All right, so just I've got 4 topics. Just a very brief introduction to where collaboration has even come from in federal forest management. You know, here we are in 2020 still talking about it, and it has its origins about 20 years ago, or actually closer to 30 years ago. And then get into this notion of collaborative resilience. What is it? Why should any of us care about it? But I think we can all answer that question in different ways. And then introduce a framework to think through the different attributes of and forces and factors that affect collaborative resilience, and then work through a worksheet exercise in a breakout group format. So hopefully we'll have some chance to do some interaction, some sharing, and those kinds of things. So collaboration in federal forest management in many ways has been around actually quite a long time. Even some of the photos that I have here going back to the early 1990s. But if you think about the arrangement between federal government and the state government around fire protection, that goes back into the 19-teens with the Clark-McNary Act and the Weeks Act that really sets up a collaborative arrangement between state governments and the forestry agencies and the federal government in terms of fire protection. But when we really see a multi-stakeholder approach where you have a diversity of community stakeholders engaged, is we really saw that popping up in the early 1990s in response to a variety of legal policy conflicts, especially in the Northwest, but it really kind of bled all across the US by the time we get into the mid-1990s. And these early innovators and adopters of collaboration were really desperate to try to find some solution to get out of persistent legal policy conflict. Some of the very earliest ones that I got attached to is the Applegate Partnership down in southwestern Oregon. The Quincy Library Group was very famous, had a lot of publicity, and is a project that Dennis and I have dealt with. And then in my own backyard, the Public Lands Partnership out in western Colorado. And there's actually still articles online from High Country News back in 1996 from this issue. But if you fast forward today, both the Public Lands Partnership and the Quincy Library Group are essentially defunct. They're not really operating and around anymore. And so, and then the Applegate Partnership has evolved and transformed, incorporating a larger portfolio around watershed restoration and those kinds of things. And so when we see kind of the evolution and sustainability collaboration, we see a lot of groups start up, kind of get going for a while, and then they either go away or they morph into something else. And that's actually quite consistent with some of the data that the National Forest Foundation has with a lot of groups that they have. So collaboration, like any relationship, it evolves, it changes, and it's challenging to sustain. But so what? The so what really gets at that collaboration has really evolved from a grassroots need into a policy instrument at the national level dealing with forest and fire issues. It really started in the 1990s that we saw the emergence of ecosystem management as an idea, but then really in the early 2000s with large wildland fires and fires that really exceeded people's understandings and abilities to address, gave rise to the National Fire Plan, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And then as we move into revising rules and regulations around national forest planning, collaboration becomes a really central part of kind of the national policy direction and rules and regs associated with those. And then as we get into the 2010s and teens, we have the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, of which I think there's a couple in Idaho that are CFLRPs, and then the Cohesive Strategy, and of course the this topic of today of your workshop is shared stewardship. And so collaboration is really a foundation upon which a lot of hope and dreams of national forest policy and wildland fire management policy is resting on. And so if that's the case, then we should care about how sustainable they are. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to introduce kind of where the idea of collaborative resilience is coming from. And this is a project that Tyler and I at CFRI, working with Ben Irie at National Forest Foundation, some colleagues at Ecological Restoration Institute, and then folks in the Washington office of the U.S. Forest Service to compile a set of lessons learned around the first round of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration program projects. And so we have a pretty broad portfolio of questions, but the first one is really looking at the nature of collaboration, the C and the CFLRP, and what can we learn from the collaboration that occurred in the first 10 years of CFLRP as it informs CFLRP 2.0, shared stewardship, and all these other initiatives that I had mentioned. So our role is really to compile and synthesize a variety of studies that have already existed looking at collaboration, from the academic research to a variety of assessments and reviews done by other organizations like the Pinchot Institute, and then the Forest Service has conducted several reviews and assessments about the CFLRP program. So a couple of the findings that we've come up with is that most of the research is really point in time, right? It's kind of academic researchers like Chelsea and myself and Dennis kind of dropping into a collaborative group, doing maybe some surveys or interviews, and then turning around and going out and making sense of it and publishing it. One of the things we haven't really seen yet is anything in the way of longitudinal research. So we don't know how these programs have evolved and changed over time. So it really leaves open these questions that have remained unanswered, which is what really does contribute to resilience. Okay, and given the enormous amount of costs and risks and some of the data that Chelsea presented, is it worth it? And I think that's still a critical question that all of us need to ask as we're kind of moving through our work. And so Tyler and I have vetted with our partners kind of this idea of looking forward, thinking about ways in which we can incorporate this idea of collaborative resilience within the next round of CFLRP, and ways in which we can introduce this to groups that are working through shared stewardship initiatives at the state and then at the watershed or place-based level. So we really draw upon some of the ecological work, the ecological research and science around resilience, and kind of borrow a lot of those concepts because they're very familiar and similar. And so right there is the definition that we're using, which is the ability of a collaborative group to absorb and then recover and reorganize from disruptions so that they can still retain some kind of level of functioning. So there's two parts of resilience. One part is the nature of the disturbance itself, right? The type, the severity, the duration, and when we think about forest systems, the type and severity and duration of a disturbance can affect the ability of that forest system to recover, similar to a collaborative group. Right? So some are more easily, you can think about a low intensity surface fire. A lot of forest systems can respond, absorb, and recover from that versus a high severity fire. The collaborative resilience, the other side of it, is the ability of a collaborative to actually take some control and some power to be able to withstand those disruptions, to anticipate and plan, to be able to accumulate resources, to be able to recover and reorganize quickly, to take risks, and to be able to do some innovation. But it's also to be able to, in that anticipatory planning approaches, to monitoring and to learn and to kind of really adopt a culture of learning and adaptation. Right. So that's one of the working hypotheses, and it's not a very fancy one though, is that resilience, collaborative resilience is really what, if we're relying on collaboratives to be the workhorses for shared stewardship and all these other initiatives, how they're resilient to these changes really will drive the success of things like shared stewardship. So we have to pay attention to those. So, every good academic research project has an elaborate conceptual diagram. This is our diagram. I'm not going to go in too much detail over it, other than to say that collaboratives, and you all know this, you operate within a dynamic system with a lot of moving parts. This diagram is really an effort to break those pieces down into some constituent components, where you have forces and factors that are internal to a collaborative group, right? People coming and going. You have a variety of learning processes, consensus and conflict management approaches. You have agency people that have their own performance measures, budgets, and accountability systems, as well as your own participants have that as well. Within the larger geographic area and context, you have changes that may affect the collaboration in terms of the local area's economy, the ecology, its community demographics, and how it navigates land use and population growth and those kinds of things. And then the third type of factor are what we call top-down factors. These are more related to policy, top-down policies and initiatives, where you have legal, political, as well as some economic forces, like things like global trade and capital movement across different kinds of sectors. So looking at those a little bit further, some of the factors that we have found in our literature synthesis, things that we've already talked about during this workshop here, is participant turnover, not only within the agencies, but stakeholders. We have turnover in elected officials, right? We have different funding streams that grow and then get taken away. Lots of things that are associated with public force management that are inherently unresolvable. There are conflicts and disputes. We have sometimes have difficult people with difficult behaviors to deal with, and those kinds of things. New research and monitoring that come out that can also affect your collaborative. Some more specific items relating to local areas, ecology, economy, and communities. In our research, we actually found that halfway through a CFLRP program, there'd be some fairly large, high severity fires that have really impacted the ability to do on-the-ground restoration work, and had to redirect attention and resources towards something else. A listing of a threatened or endangered species, or kind of lingering conflicts and disputes. Of course, the tenuousness, especially in the Intermountain West, of forest industry and operating capacity, changing demographics and changing economic drivers that are occurring in communities. All of those things can also affect the functioning of a collaborative. And then from the top down, new policies, laws, different changes in administration and policy direction. And then, of course, here in the last point, we have global pandemics that's really affecting the ability of collaborative groups to function, and how do we respond and adapt to that. So one of the things that we are kind of wrapping up with in this 10-year review is kind of thinking about some practical ways in which collaboratives can problem solve their way through this question of collaborative resilience. And one thing that we had pulled together is this worksheet that you see. It's also is part of the website. So hopefully you have access to that. And what we want to do is to engage you in completing this worksheet, and then having some breakout groups and having some discussion around these questions. And so looking at the worksheet here, we have identifying what is can you name one internal or external change that your collaborative group has experienced with recently? Something that really ate your lunch, something that was unanticipated. What did that disruption do to your collaborative function or performance? What are ways in which your collaborative was able to prepare for, respond, or mitigate the impacts of that disruption? And what are some barriers and constraints that inhibited your ability to be able to absorb and recover from that? So before we piloted this worksheet at a workshop that the 3 Restoration Institutes had convened in early March. Some of you know Liz Gebhardt Johnson from the Priest Forest Coalition. She attended, was unfortunately not able to attend this workshop today, but so we had our 150 participants in that workshop from a variety of collaborative groups from New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado complete this worksheet. And Tyler's busily accumulating and summarizing those results at this point. So we wanted to bring this worksheet to this workshop as another way of kind of testing things out, but also providing you all with hopefully a framework and a way to have a more structured conversation around collaborative resilience. So before I get into the how this is going to pan out, I'll take some questions right now. I can't. Oops.
You should be able to unmute yourself now again, but if you are having trouble with that, you can also use the raised hand feature under the participants icon. If you click on that, it'll pull up the participants panel, and you can use the raised hand feature, and Tony can call on people through that.
And I also know Carolyn just attached the worksheet to the chat board for you to be able to download. Okay, awkward silence on Zoom. It's okay. So John asks, any insights on how you define a collaborative? That's an easy question. Very, very short answer to that. There is not a great sort of stock definition. I think that's probably warrants a whole workshop in and of itself. But I think what we're really talking about are a process by which interested and effective individuals and organizations are able to take part in kind of working through conflicts and addressing kind of the situation in a productive way. So it ought to be inclusive. It ought to be open. It ought to have some ground rules that emphasize transparency and equity of voice. There ought to be some accountability measures so that it's that are associated with things like performance metrics and those kinds of things. But I think in general, those are kind of attributes that we see fairly commonly across space and time. And then as you get into things like structure and processes and those kinds of things, there's some variations in that way. And then Bill asks, what is land management agency role in facilitating and supporting collaboration? I think, there's definitely a lot of good studies out there that really document kind of the range of variation that we see in a lot of cases, you have a line officer that really helps instigate and reach out to convene a group of people, but then kind of it's more of a dialogue because of some of the issues related to Federal Advisory Committee Act that you want to avoid some of those red flag triggers. More common than not is what we see the agency as a kind of a clear and an active participant and clearly a technical resource. But often we see a pooling of resources to be able to hire a third-party facilitator or a coordinator to be able to serve as a convener. So it kind of creates a little bit of a firewall to kind of safeguard some of those flags. Let's see. Maybe I'll take one more question. Maybe this is more of a comment from Pam. It seems to be a lot of. Yeah, so Pam asked the question about are there studies that look at offering skills that relate to things like emotional intelligence and kind of interpersonal people skills to collaborative members, a lot like we offer ecological science information to collaborative members. I think there was actually a question from Chelsea's presentation that related to things like trainings and resources that are available. You know, I think you know, Ben's organization, the National Forest Foundation, provides a lot of direct assistance and to collaborative groups. Also offers a series of peer learning webinars, and perhaps, Ben, that might be a good topic to follow up on. If you haven't seen the Conservation Connect segment of National Forest Foundation, lots of great resources that have compiled around that. But I do think that, especially as in my personal opinion, and I think should probably move on from this, but I think the ability to have civil dialogue and really around a learning orientation, we've really seen that kind of erode in the last while now. And so I think that training and that is more important than ever. There's actually lots of other tools beyond natural resource and forest issues around mindful communication and difficult conversation. So I think there's a lot more that's out there because I think lots of communities are struggling with this kind of issue. Okay, so I'm going to move on to be able to maintain some time as we're moving into the breakout session. So if you have your worksheet, if you can pull it up, and I have it pulled up here, and if you can maybe have it on the side, here's how this is going to go down, and kind of how we've budgeted between now and the rest of the time that we have on collaborative resilience. So the first thing we want you to do is take 10 minutes, probably at the most. We don't want to have to spend too much time, but spend 10 minutes to complete 1 or 2 lines in this worksheet. So each line is for one disruption your collaborative has experienced. Okay? And then after the 10 minutes, we'll ring a gong or have some signal, and then you will be assigned, Carolyn's assigning all of us into breakout rooms in separate Zoom rooms. So we're all gonna leave this main Zoom meeting room, and we're gonna be broken out into separate rooms. And the breakouts, I think we've budgeted about 15 minutes for kind of a dialogue and discussion about what everybody's put on their worksheets. We want everybody to introduce yourself using that chat function, just like Caroline suggested that you do at the beginning of this session. Each breakout group will have a facilitator to guide the discussion for one line in this worksheet. So we really want to dig deeper into What is a disruption that affected a collaborative? Is that a disruption that's common across collaborative groups? And then how has that collaborative dealt with it? What are the strategies that were able to overcome that? And what are some things that are still missing? What are some barriers if your collaborative hasn't done that? And one of the things that we want to make sure we hear from folks that are actually part of collaborative groups, really be able to share these stories and have a conversation among themselves. So even though it's only 15 minutes, I think when we had organized this in the in-person, it was going to be about a 30 to 40 minute discussion, but we want to limit that in our Zoom meeting. After our breakouts, we're going to come back to the main Zoom room. We'll have each facilitator will report out so we can kind of hear from everybody else, kind of have a discussion and debrief. And then I have a couple of polling questions with regard to this concept and this worksheet, so we can continue to refine how we deploy this work at a larger scale. So anything to add to that, Caroline, or any questions that anybody has about this?
Just to add really briefly, if people will be staying with us, which we hope you do, it's going to be a great discussion, please stay in the Zoom. I noticed a couple of people have dropped off. I just want to clarify, for doing this worksheet on your own for the next 10 minutes, we want you to stay in the Zoom, as that will help me put everyone into the breakout groups. So what's going to happen is you're going to take these 10 minutes, I'm going to set up the breakout groups, and then you hear a bell coming off, and then I will see everyone's faces come back, and then I will set you off into your breakout groups. And so just to briefly explain that a little more so you know what's going to happen when you come back, you will see a little prompt on your screen that directs you to a breakout room. You will click accept, and you will go to either breakout room Tony, John, Elizabeth, or Tyler, and they will be your 4 facilitators in the breakout room. And I will broadcast messages while you're in that room, letting you know the time you have left of those 15 minutes. And when time is over, you will then click accept to return to the main room and be automatically, again, brought back to the main room. So all you'll have to do is click accept those 2 times to switch rooms. Thank you.
So is the 10-minute clock now running? Okay.
Yep. So we're good to go. So start the worksheet and you'll hear a ding go off here shortly.
Okay, this is your homework.
So you're taking 3 more minutes for the worksheet individually. Thank you. And there is our timer. So thank you all for taking those first 10 minutes to work on the worksheet. See if people are joining us here in their video screens. So thank you for turning on those video screens. So now I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. And again, we'll have a little screen that pops up in just a moment to accept the breakout room. And each of the facilitators are being sorted into their own rooms. And then in the breakout rooms, you can use the raised hand function to help communicate, and you'll be able to unmute yourselves in the breakout rooms as well. And one last note, if you do have any issues, at the top of your screen, there'll be a button that says ask or request for help. You can click that, and as the main host, I can pop into the different breakout rooms and check in on anything. All right, here we go.
Okay, shoot. Who's talking? I can't hear anybody. Is this not working?
I think Peg is trying to talk.
Uh-oh.
Hey, Tony, this is Caroline. Jumped in here to check in. As a co-host, you should also be able to unmute people if they have any issues. Other people should be able to unmute themselves now too. And yeah, it has been a request to go back to gallery view.
Okay. So sorry, can you repeat that? I was doing like two things at once.
Sure. So as the co-host, you can also unmute people, but everyone should be able to unmute themselves now as well.
Okay. So I asked for a volunteer. Oh, Pam. Okay.
Yeah, I'd be willing to volunteer. I want to volunteer, but I also want to say I'm from Oregon and this is an Idaho conference. And so if there's anyone from an Idaho collaborative who would like to jump in first, I feel like I should be deferential to that.
Good idea.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Bill Higgins. I've been in part of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative for close to 12 years, and we're going through some major disruption. So.
Okay, can you talk about it?
Yeah, a couple items I listed, the categories. You can pick one you want to explore. One was, we had significant funding and paid staff and whatnot that went away. And so we've gone to an all volunteer group, and the capacity to do that is greatly limited. So it's limited the scope of what we can do. We were doing a lot of big things and feels like now we're doing small things. And then the second item was really, I guess it's probably zone of agreement. We had this big scope of these big problems we were going to solve, besides just active management being one item where we've made progress. The other items were like solving what are probably unresolvable issues or hard to reach consensus on, like wilderness designations, those types of things, and the inability to reach consensus on that is really inhibiting the collaborative's ability to move forward. And in amongst all of that is leadership changes within the collaborative capacity. So it's a struggle.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for volunteering.
All right. Who else wants to keep going?
Hey, John. Oh, sorry there, Randy. This is Eric Crawford. I'm with Trout Unlimited. I sit on the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, and although a very, very new member as just recently last fall, the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, I'm sure everybody's aware of, has been kind of struggling a bit. And from what I've seen, I've been kind of taken aback by how aggressive some members are and how much impasse there really is, and the lack of any kind of effort to collaborate. It's just, it appears they want it their way, and that's it. So as a new member to a collaborative, I've really been surprised by this attitude that exists, particularly after hearing so many good things about the Clearwater Basin Collaborative and how much they have accomplished through the years. It's just very striking, but that's my contribution.
Hi, John, this is Tim Love, and I'll jump in if that's okay. I work with 23 collaboratives in Montana, and I think this is a common problem for, all of them. And of course, there's a certain ebb and flow with that, but as much of the internal transition and in organization as much as external, with agencies. So it's a real issue, I think, that spans all collaborative groups.
You're talking about the turnover.
I am within the collaborative organizations themselves.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? We can definitely have an own conference on all of these. So just curious, any other thoughts on anything else that folks want to?
It obviously puts a strain on staff time and going out and evaluating the current project, as well as it's a CE because it's insect and disease. So the collaborative didn't really have any input in the administration of that insect and disease treatment. Not that that's a bad thing. I think we need to be out there and be proactive about those issues. It's just a resource issue for the forest and keeping the project moving forward in a timely manner, the larger collaborative project.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. Anyone else want to add something relatively quickly? We got about 6 minutes left and got to get through 2 more points of this worksheet. Want to make sure everybody who has something to say can speak up. Okay, we might move on. I should say, Michael, I really like your image in the background. I don't know how you got the video to actually work, but it's pretty cool. So for those of you who have been impacted by pest and pathogen disturbance and or catastrophic wildfire in your planning area or in the collaborative kind of footprint, in what ways have you responded? And I guess one thing that struck me, Michael, when you were responding was, because it was a CE, the collaborative wasn't much involved. So was there any kind of communication and outreach that you did to kind of help provide that process to give them some involvement, maybe not in terms of the actual planning process or
collaborative groups to get projects and objectives accomplished.
Right, great. Megan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Oswald. I'm the Northern Region Collaborative Relations Coordinator, and I provide support internally and externally to collaborative groups and have engaged with most in Idaho, Northern Idaho, and Montana.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. Chelsea might have walked away since she's a picture. All right, so our first question really is, what is that first big disruption that we want to talk about as a large group? So hopefully you've identified in that worksheet a number of different disruptions, but I'd love for someone to throw out a recommendation of a disruption that they believe is probably relevant to a lot of different collaboratives, and we'll start working with that one. Who would like to throw out an idea?
Project litigation.
Project litigation. Okay, Ben, can you tell us a little bit more about how you've seen that disrupt a collaborative and what that impact may look like?
Well, I guess quickly, I think of it more as it wasn't much of a disruption. I would say it kind of coalesced the Panhandle Forest Collaborative. We had to, we were heavily involved, or the collaborative was heavily involved in the project, and it was litigated, and then they kind of the collaborative refined their approach and made sure that they were on solid ground, and then filed an amicus.
Okay. Have other collaborative members from collaboratives or those who've supported collaboratives had a similar disruption?
Yeah, this is Lynn. I would say for the Boise Forest Collaborative, the response to the Pioneer Fire and support of subsequent litigation that happened from that in the collaborative.
Great.
This is Cheryl. I'd say that yes, however, it resulted in the opposite. It really was a disrupt.
Of supported wilderness. That said, we end up working on projects most of the time. And what I found successful about PFC is its role with the Forest Service, and the National Forest Foundation has facilitated, which has been huge to have someone paid to do that, to help run meetings, keep track of things. But the project level work is also of great interest to me, is why I stay with things. If I was only in it for wilderness designation, I probably would have walked away from all of my collaborations. But I'm very interested in how the restoration gets done, and that it follows science and its landscape level. So to me, there's still a lot of value in being in collaborations, despite the fact that one of our major interests is not being met with people not talking about wilderness.
Gotcha. So having a portfolio of interests to be able to, if one thing goes away, you're still other interests that are being met by being at the table.
And I think you build trust and relationships, and that's where I see my involvement with Shoshone-Benoit Forest Health Group. These are rural communities. They're very concerned about the economics. I am too. And so we build trust over individual projects. We go out on the ground, and my hope is that eventually they'll start getting interested in wilderness. But if I only said, we can't meet unless we talk wilderness, that would have been the end of it.
What else? Diane, I think you were about to jump in. Is Diane still there? Anyone else? This is good.
Out in Oregon, we have shared some similar challenges with the lack of funding and the inability to keep a coordinator or a facilitator on as full-time as they really need to be on to get the work done. And the kinds of things that results in lack of memory of what needs to happen. For example, new people come in, 2 or 3 years down the line, they still haven't been shown the operating principles. They don't know where to find the information. They don't have enough time to do the work to actually write the grant proposals to get the funding, because they're only on half time as is or less. They have a hard time,
of agreement, but because it's been dragging on for whatever 5 years, 6 years now, there's just been a lot of turnover in the collaborative and within the agency, but in the collaborative, and so a lot of them don't understand the history on it just because it takes so long. So, but a lot of similarities to what, especially on the support side, and having folks coalesce.
Okay. Other impacts, either positive or negative, associated with the project being litigated that the collaborative has worked on?
I just wanted to share, I guess, maybe a slightly alternate perspective, which is that in some collaboratives that I've been involved in, leadership of the group getting really focused on primarily being engaged in litigation and kind of going head to head with the litigators in the papers, or or in kind of a what's taking up the time and energy of the group, can really be a drag on morale and feel like progress isn't being made very quickly. And I think a lot of collaboratives really get their energy from working on a project and seeing it on the ground and see it get done. And when litigation takes years and you're putting your energy into that instead of collaborating on new projects and seeing things move forward, it can really be a drag on the energy.
Right. So for those who have experience, or even those who have maybe been an onlooker into some of these collaboratives that have been dealing with litigated projects, what are some of the tools or resources that were brought to that process or that issue to help bolster the resilience of the collaborative? So to help them through that litigation, whatever struggles they were having, or maybe for those, you know, Lynn and Ben, you said it helped coalesce our members. What was the secret sauce that allowed that to happen?
Yeah, I would say, I think our secret sauce was the forest had quite a bit more engagement than they typically have had. It was extremely focused, and the collaboratives worked with us for each step of the way. So we put a lot of effort into the collaborative relationship during that time, and I think that's what made it successful. On the downside is we weren't able to keep up that level of commitment to the collaborative after we resolved the issues in the Pioneer Fire.
Right.
I'd say for the Panhandle Forest Collaborative, part of the secret sauce, one of the ingredients was AFRC, having AFRC involved, and their attorney being very involved in the collaborative group, helping us kind of navigate those waters was part of it. Another part of it was the protocols that the collaborative already had in place. We simply needed to return to those protocols and make sure we were dotting our I's and crossing our T's there, as far as like the structure of of the group, and you know what our purpose was and why we were involved in the litigation. That was a big part of it. And then I think another part of it, the secret sauce, was just having been closely involved in the project on the NIFMA side, project development, gave the collaborative a lot of expertise and really showed that they were behind the project from the get-go. A diverse set of stakeholders were behind the project from the get-go.
Great.
Elizabeth?
Okay, it looks like we're getting kicked out, everyone.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, Lynn. We've got 56 seconds.
I said the other part of our secret
Is everybody back? Carolyn, do you have a sense of that? Okay.
Yep, everyone's back now.
All right. Well, hopefully folks were able to navigate the technological bridge and have some time and discussion. I felt like in our group we were just starting to really dig into a topic, and then we had to come back, and we knew this was, I knew this was going to happen, so I apologize for this being cut short. But so what we wanted to do is let's hear from all the groups so everybody gets a sense of kind of what the topics were, what the disruptions were, and then kind of work through one of the lines. So I'm going to pick on Tyler, you want to go first? Can you unmute?
Yeah, sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So we focused on ecological disturbance as the change agent, and specifically looking at catastrophic fire and insect disturbance. This had both positive and negative impacts. The positive impact with regards to catastrophic wildfire is that there was a lot more money going around to go after larger scale landscape scale projects, and collaboratives were working together to approach projects faster and at larger scales to get work done on the ground. In terms of negative impacts, with the Payette Forest Coalition, there was an area that was already planned for treatments and had an insect disturbance on that plan area. So it put a little bit more work on the staff and kind of slowed things down, but also importantly, because it was a categorical exclusion, the collaborative didn't have much say or have much participation in how the project unfolded. In terms of responses to those stressors, with the insect disturbance, the collaborative did review the project on the ground and had an in-depth discussion at the collaborative meeting and developed a supportive letter from the collaborative to the forest to make sure that the priorities of the collaboratives paralleled the priorities in the treatment. In terms of wildfire, their responses, there seems to be, in California at least, a desire to engage specialists for landscape scale strategic planning, using LIDAR and things like that, and also an intent to speed up the planning process and supporting forests by bringing in other specialists to support planning. For example, having a NEPA team that just assist and support the forest in developing NEPA documents. And then finally, some of the barriers that inhibited response in terms of wildfire or anything really is having a lot of turnover with the NEPA teams, for example. To support that capacity, it's taking extra time to get them on board, to get them up to speed, especially if folks don't have experience working in the West. And then within the context of categorical exclusions and the insect disturbance, you know, there's a mismatch in the timing of when and the opportunity for public involvement might not align with the schedule of the collaborative to meet. So if they can't meet in time to discuss this and provide a window to give feedback, then there's a misalignment there. And then Philip brought up not a barrier, but how to overcome those barriers. And that's just reestablishing relationships to deal with turnover and disturbance, and these need to be maintained. And he mentioned that one big way to do this is to have some long-standing members and facilitation that provides that open space to bring new people on and move the collaborative forward.
Okay, great. Let's see, who Elizabeth was a facilitator. Who else was a facilitator?
I will go next, and I will be quick because I know that we are running short on time. So the issue that we discussed in detail was the impact that litigation has when there's a project that the collaborative has been engaged on and it's litigated by outside parties. The impacts were obvious in the sense of delays with regard to implementation of the project and extended timelines, but then there was also a spectrum of impacts to the collaborative itself that were identified. Some collaboratives stated that the experience actually allowed them to gel a bit more, and that it strengthened relationships among the collaborative and with the Forest Service specifically. Others said that the project impact or the project litigation actually had more of a divisive impact, and it led to some fissures in the group. So I asked the group, you know, really when you had these both negative and positive impacts, what was some of the resources or secrets to success for addressing that impact and moving forward? A big piece of it was that there was a lot of attention directed specifically to that project and to the collaborative. So for example, the Forest Service was allowed to spend some additional time on that project because of urgency and need. And that increased engagement really helps support the relationship building. Another resource, IFRP, I know is a key player, specifically when projects that are engaging with collaboratives are challenged. So having that legal support to walk the collaborative through the litigation process and help them engage in a meaningful way, that was really important. Being involved in the ground level decision-making or project development at the NIFMA side, that was really important. And then having strong foundational protocols to rely back on prior to this litigation even happening. So really making sure that you look back at how you govern yourself and make sure that you're following those rules. So that was identified. And then I think just with regard to additional challenges, capacity on all levels is still going to be the consistent challenge. So when there isn't a high urgent need, Forest Service capacity has to be redirected to other projects. And then there is a lack of momentum or sometimes a drag on momentum when there is long-term delays in project implementation.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth. John?
Great. We had a good discussion, and of course, Forest Service and collaborative participant turnover was one of the topics. Recruitment is another topic, but we also spent more time talking about some of the internal issues of a collaborative in terms of functioning collaboratively. And so we have issues where some members of a collaborative are maybe not behaving collaboratively, not exhibiting that behavior, perhaps being overly aggressive or taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room, and also being more divisive than a collaborative might otherwise be. And so when you have a very strong individuals in there or factions in there that that causes a lot of confusion among the collaborative, it also, I think, causes confusion to on the Forest Service part if they're getting feedback from the collaborative, taking recommendations from them. So when you have a somewhat fractious collaborative, it can slow things down in terms of making recommendations. You kind of revisit decisions you already thought you made, send the Forest Service mixed messages, and then participants, I start questioning, is this worth the investment? You know, are we actually just, dumbing things down or recommendations so much that they're kind of worthless? And so some of the going through our worksheet, some of the ways to respond to, prepare for, and mitigate these impacts are having strong protocols. So, thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down, and saying, hey, we took a decision on that, and we are not going to revisit that at every single meeting. Being respectful, reminding folks that we actually, are going to treat each other with respect. We're going to listen to each other. We're not going to interrupt. And also having some firm decisions or protocols for decision-making and consequences. What happens if someone says one thing, but then they do something else? And some collaboratives have sideboards and protocols to address that. Some don't. And you're like, well, who would do that? And then when it happens, you're kind of don't have the, you're left wondering what to do. Another thing that has been really important is just having a commitment to follow through. I think just what's the decision-making process? And one thing, and we didn't get to this, but I'm just going to raise it in here, is one of the factors that's made a difference in the collaboratives I've been involved with, is having a shared set of facts you're working from. And so if everyone's picking their own set of facts and making their own interpretations, it's very fractious and it's very hard to reach consensus. Where if you're all looking at the same metric there, that is different. And also looking at goals. Are we actually on, what's our purpose and need? What is our goal? What does success look like? The last thing I wanted to talk about, I think Tony might mention this too, is this little exercise stimulated a lot of ideas and definitely like, oh my gosh, our collaborative's not doing that, and we can definitely improve this. But spending a little time after a decision is made and saying, how'd that work? And is everyone on board with it? Feel like, oh, actually, I felt like I maybe have overspoken or took up too much space in the meeting, or I never felt heard on this. So sometimes to review the implementation and effectiveness of our collaborative decisions is something that, yeah, it's a little wishy-washy and touchy-feely and all this stuff, but I think it can help build resilience, and something that we often skip when we're going on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, that kind of that reflection, either at an annual meeting or some kind of periodic check-in, that can also help you anticipate, and adapt down the road. Just the one topic that we had covered, we had very similar topics. The one that wasn't mentioned was a pretty rapid loss of funding and staff within a fairly short period of time, and this came from Bill Higgins with the Clearwater Basin. And that reduction then really put the work back on the shoulders of the participants that are really acting as volunteers. And so that by relying just on the volunteers, it reduced the scope of activities and issues that could be worked on, wasn't able to address a lot of the complexity that the collaborative was dealing with in terms of the multiplicity of interests and issues, and really put a bigger focus on specific projects while other things were on the back burner. So there is some adaptation there. The one consequence is that a lot of participants that were there for the larger set of issues and the bigger complexities around things like wilderness designations and special designations, those are now, a lot of those folks are no longer participating or not as active as the folks had to focus more on projects. The big barrier, the inhibitor is that there's decisions that are made about funding and the resources that are available for collaborative to do that hard work on the ground. That a lot of policy changes or funding reallocations that are really out of the control of the collaborative itself, and really requires either a coalition approach, or is there an opportunity for the shared stewardship agreement to create some more stability around available resources if collaboratives are going to be the workhorses for making this work happen. And we also talked about turnover, also talked about the complexity of some of these hard to reach consensus issues as well that also affect collaborative groups. So, I think we can probably spend a lot more time than a day and a half on this topic, and maybe this is something that we have an opportunity to bring back, check in with you at a future date. But Caroline, I'm wondering if so there's in terms of just the wrap up, we have a couple of polling questions. And then I have one request, is that those of you who have filled this out and are willing to, Tyler and I are collecting these. So if you're willing to share them and make a copy or something and send one to us, they'll be anonymous. We're mostly looking at what's the range and diversity of those disruptive issues that and a tool around to provide resources and ideas for police collaboratives. So we're assembling a lot of ideas and feedback from all across the Intermountain West that are folks dealing with this similar issue. So if you're willing to do that, at the bottom of the sheet is my email.
Okay, so I'm going to launch I'm going to launch the polling right now. You can answer those questions, and now I'm going to hand it off to Dennis and John to wrap us up.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. So yeah, please go ahead and fill out that poll. And as you're thinking about these questions, but you're also probably thinking about many other questions that we didn't get to. Tony's right. I think we were in a lot of these breakout groups and some of the side chat I'm seeing, conversation was just really getting going. We didn't know how much time to allocate for this. So it was really nice to see that those conversations rolling and some continuity, or at least some consistency in some of the themes that were coming out. To that end, I guess for my closing part of this, and then I'll turn it over to John to do the ending. I'm not going to commit anybody to next steps at this point. It's not my place to do that. But some of the things that have been going through my mind is given all these questions that aren't answered yet, perhaps there'll be an opportunity for some dialogue post conference with those who have registered and have participated. And so, as I say, I'm not going to commit anybody to do that. I'm certainly not going to commit myself yet to do that. That's a bit of a work, but I think this has been a good conversation, as good as we could have expected given circumstances and our first time trying this. And so I appreciate everybody really sticking with that. And I do think there is opportunity to carry this conversation forward, both building on what Tony and Chelsea have talked about this morning, building on the themes and our speakers from yesterday and that conversation, in order to carry us into that time when we are together again in person. And so that we do fulfill the objective of the IFRP, which is to provide a platform to share ideas, to work together, to share stories and break bread, so to speak. And so I just very appreciate everybody making an attempt to do that in this platform, and hopefully we can carry that forward. John, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. And I'll just simply echo first what Dennis said about some kind of method or platform to continue a dialogue in dealing with these questions that we could not deal with at this kind of format like we wanted to. I'll leave with something that came up in side questions to me, and I gather it came up in some of the other groups, and I want to approach it by trying to be encouraging, but it's what happens when you do these collaboratives in this political context we're living in today. 2 years ago, I spent some time with the media talking about these collaboratives and what the criticism they were getting from what I would call sort of purist environmental groups who would argue that everybody in a collaborative is a sellout artist of one kind or another, which is in my view ridiculous. I got a side conversation about people now from the very far right making the same arguments about collaborations, that they're dishonest, they're tricky, and so forth. I don't think any of that's true. That's the nature of our politics right now, but I want to encourage everybody that you've kind of got to stand together on this stuff. We're sort of got a lot of fragmented politics now. People that believe things that are perhaps not based in truth, bringing up facts that aren't facts. And I realize this can be very frustrating for collaboratives that are trying to get stuff done and trying to keep relationships intact. And it's just something that has to be endured. You'll certainly get a lot of support from people like me if I get called by the media to try to at least to put some reality back in these conversations. So I'll second what Dennis said about keeping these questions and conversations going. I just want to be encouraging to people that these are just tough times, but we can endure through these times. And I think a lot of good things happen in this meeting. So I don't want that to be the last word necessarily if Dennis or somebody wants to say any kind of closing final thoughts, but I wanted to get that out there. Are we good? Carolyn, do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to say to everybody? Because you did the hard lifting throughout all of this.
I just want to say thank you to everyone that came today. Having this great turnout and amazing participation in the breakout rooms really made the effort we put into this worth it. So thank you all for taking the time out of your days to come and join us and really dig deep in the breakout rooms. Cool. Thank you all.